For nearly 200 years, since the very first Neanderthal bones were pulled out of a German valley in 1856, one question has haunted paleoanthropology more than almost any other. Neanderthals were not weak. They were not stupid. They survived multiple ice ages, hunted massive animals with handmade spears, controlled fire, buried their dead, and lived successfully across Europe and Asia for roughly 400,000 years, far longer than modern humans have existed at all. And then, in a geological instant, they vanished. For decades, the explanation seemed obvious. Either the climate killed them, or we did. Pick a villain, end the story. A study published in early 2026, led by anthropologist Ariane Burke at the Université de Montréal, just demonstrated that both of those simple answers were wrong, or at least dangerously incomplete. And what her team found instead points to something far stranger, and far more relevant to understanding our own species than most people realize. Let's set the scene properly first. The period in question is called Marine Isotope Stage 3, roughly 60,000 to 35,000 years ago. This was not a steady decline into one long ice age. It was chaos. The climate swung wildly and repeatedly between brutally cold stadial periods and warmer interstadial periods, sometimes within the span of a single human lifetime. Forests turned to tundra and back again. Herds of prey animals shifted their migration routes as the vegetation changed beneath them. This was precisely the period during which the last Neanderthal populations disappear from the archaeological record, and precisely the period during which Homo sapiens, having arrived from Africa, somehow took hold and never let go. For a long time, two competing theories dominated the explanation. The first, the climate itself was simply too unstable, and Neanderthals couldn't adapt fast enough. The second, Homo sapiens outcompeted them directly, for territory, for resources, for survival, in something resembling a slow, motion conflict between two species for the same land. Burke's team didn't try to test those theories with more bones, more stone tools, or more DNA. Instead, they borrowed an entirely different scientific toolkit, one built for an entirely different purpose. In modern conservation biology, scientists studying endangered animals use something called species distribution modeling. The basic idea: take a species' known habitat preferences, temperature ranges, vegetation types, water access, combine that with climate and terrain data, and predict where else that species could theoretically survive across a landscape, even in places no one's directly observed them. Conservationists use this to figure out where to focus protection efforts, where corridors between habitats need to be preserved, where a population might be quietly cut off from the rest of its species without anyone noticing until it's too late. Burke's team pointed this exact toolkit backward in time. They treated Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens like two competing species being tracked by a wildlife biologist. Using archaeological sites instead of camera, trap sightings, and asked, based on everything we know about where each species could plausibly survive, what did the map of livable Europe actually look like for each of them, as the climate lurched back and forth? The results were not what either old theory predicted. Climate stress alone didn't explain it. Neanderthals had already survived previous glacial cycles, just as severe as this one. They were, if anything, a famously cold, adapted species, built with stocky frames and reinforced cold weather physiology. Pure climate catastrophe doesn't hold up as the single cause, because they'd weathered worse before and come out the other side. Direct competition didn't fully explain it either. The habitat suitable for Homo sapiens and habitat suitable for Neanderthals didn't simply collide head-on across the continent the way a straightforward turf war would require. In many regions, the two species' optimal zones barely overlapped at all. What the models revealed instead was something almost invisible in the archaeological record, until you map it this way: a difference in the shape of the network each species was embedded in. Homo sapiens' favorable habitats across Europe turned out to be highly interconnected. Patches of good land linked to other patches of good land, forming a kind of continuous lattice a population could move through. If one region turned hostile during a sudden cold snap, A group within that lattice had somewhere to go. Neighboring groups, related groups, allied groups, existing within reach across that connected terrain. Neanderthal habitat, particularly in Eastern Europe, told a different story. The patches of suitable land were more isolated from one another, separated by terrain or distance that made regular contact between groups harder to sustain. When the climate swung hard against a population sitting in one of those isolated patches, there was no safety net. No nearby group to merge with, trade with, or temporarily move toward. The population simply had to weather the shock alone, in place, generation after generation, until eventually one shock proved too much. Burke described the difference plainly. These networks act as a safety net. They allow the exchange of information about resources and animal migrations. They allow temporary access to another group's territory during a crisis. They allow partnerships to form before a crisis even hits, so that when one does, there's already a door to knock on. This reframes the entire extinction story in an unexpected way. It was never really about who was smarter, or stronger, or better with a spear. It was about whether your social world had a back door. There's a deeply human detail tucked inside this finding that's easy to miss. We already know, from decades of genetic research, that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens interbred. Many people alive today carry small fragments of Neanderthal DNA, inherited from encounters between the two populations tens of thousands of years ago. Burke's research adds a quiet, almost melancholy footnote to that fact. In the more isolated regions of Eastern Europe, the data suggests something less like a Neanderthal population going extinct in the traditional sense, and more like a population slowly being absorbed, interbreeding, gradually folding their genetic line into the expanding Homo sapiens population around them, until there was no separate population left to count. Not a war, not a die-off, a merger forced by isolation, that simply erased the boundary between one group and another over enough generations. In the better connected refuges of southwestern Europe, where Homo sapiens networks were especially dense, the contrast becomes even sharper. Those regions appear to have anchored some of the most resilient and lasting modern human populations on the continent, precisely because the surrounding network gave them somewhere to retreat to and rebuild from whenever conditions turned hostile. So if you were looking for a single dramatic cause of the Neanderthals' disappearance, a fatal flaw, a final battle, a singular climatic catastrophe, the honest answer Burke's research gives you is messier and far more interesting than that. It was climate. It was geography. It was demography. And running underneath all of it was something almost sociological. A continent spanning difference in how connected each species, communities, were to each other when things went wrong. Which leads to an uncomfortable thought experiment, one that has nothing to do with the Ice Age. Every species, including our own, is constantly betting its long-term survival not just on individual strength or cleverness, but on the structure of the relationships connecting one group to the next. A population that's connected can absorb a shock by leaning on its neighbors. A population that's isolated has to survive that same shock entirely on its own. 40,000 years ago, that difference in network structure may have quietly decided which human species would go on to fill the entire planet, and which would fade into a few fragments of DNA scattered through the genomes of the species that replaced them. The Neanderthals weren't erased by ice or by spears. They were erased, slowly, by distance, by how far it was to the nearest door that would still open when they knocked.